Dave here for Zilog and Moto. After a whirlwind weekend, I'm back to bring you the next episode, and it's for a game that I'd toyed with reviewing before the Sega Genesis Mini dropped in and blew up the place. After getting spoiled by the Mini, and especially the brilliant port of Darius, I thought about what I should do next, and figured that this game was a good title to bring me back down to earth, so to speak. And that title is Sesame Street Counting Cafe. I know what you're thinking. Dave, why are you bothering to review an edutainment title that was designed for 6-year-olds? My response is, all these games were designed for kids. That doesn't mean that adults can't enjoy them as well, but the notion that a software title has no value unless you're destroying enemies or blowing shit up is silly. And again, the mission of the channel is to look at every game released for the 8 and 16-bit Sega console platforms. And this is one of those games. Also, Sesame Street Counting Cafe is not the only game in this particular line of Genesis titles. Known as Sega Club, they were titles released in the series on the Genesis, Sega CD, Game Gear, and even one title on the Master System in Brazil. We'll get to those other titles later, minus the Game Gear entries, but for now we're focusing on the Muppets from the Children's Television Workshop. Sesame Street Counting Cafe was only released in the United States, as was the case with most of the other Sega Club titles. And in the case of Counting Cafe, it made sense at the time that Sesame Street hadn't become the international success that it is now. If you're not familiar with Sesame Street, then first off, I feel bad for you. But briefly, Sesame Street is an educational children's show that focuses on the residents of, you guessed it, Sesame Street, which is a mix of humans and Muppets. Yes, the same Muppets from the mind of Jim Henson, but not necessarily the same characters, as Kermit the Frog would be the only Muppet to make any kind of substantial crossover between the shows. Specifically, Counting Cafe references a long-running skit scenario on Sesame Street where the Muppet Grover plays the role of a waiter at Charlie's restaurant, usually. And he serves Mr. Johnson, a balding, red-haired blue Muppet who's very specific with his order. If you haven't seen any of these skits, and again, if you haven't, I do feel sorry for you, just look up Grover Waiter on YouTube and have fun. So, just how is life at the Counting Cafe? Is it a game that actually has some quality behind it that would be fun and educational for kids and an honor to Jim Henson's legacy? Or is it a piece of shovelware designed for a console with one foot in the grave that would soon be replaced by the 32-bit era? Well, let's take a look. Okay, and here's our first Sega Club title on Zilog and Moto, and the outer cover is a little bit beat, with a few marks at the top and toward the bottom. You can kind of see right there, and some marks down there. And then as we flip over the back, there's some definite damage up here to the rear cover, and it appears that there's a chunk missing, which is always nice, from the bottom of the clamshell. But other than that, it's in decent shape. Note that in this particular case, there's no hang tab, and there never was one. Don't really know why that is. The inner cover looks good as well, except for some minor damage near the bottom of the spine, which usually happen when the inner cover slides down a little bit too far and just comes in contact with outside. One thing to throw out here is while Sega Club technically was a label Sega created for these edutainment class games designed for younger children, it wasn't used exclusively with Sega titles. In the case of Counting Cafe, this is actually an Electronic Arts title, as you can see by the EA Kids label in bright yellow down at the bottom of the front cover, and beside that there's a VRC label with the most unnecessary general audiences rating ever given. And just below that, an actually helpful thing there that says that this game is for ages 3 to 6. Above that, we've got a picture of Grover doing something you'll be doing for probably 80% of the game, and that's carrying around a tray of food in specific numbers. Also, real quick, note the Sega Club label at the top of the cover, indicating that this game is part of that series, and all the other Sega Club titles have that same logo on them. Over the back, more of that bright yellow, for whatever reason. Not sure if EA went with that to signify that it was an EA title as it matches the yellow tab on their cartridges,
or because it matches the yellow on the Sesame Street logo, but it's not pretty. Maybe eye-catching, but not in a good way. Two screenshots on the back showcase the majority of the game, which is Grover at the cafe. And down at the bottom, a third screenshot from the purely platform part of the game where you have to reclaim one of your stars every day from a monkey. Right here. The text on the back here lays out exactly what the game is, in a good way, so the parents would know what the game is designed to help their kids with. And then the green box spells out exactly what the features of the game are in bullet points. I've got a small beef with the line about the 36 progressively challenging levels of play, and we'll get to more of that in a bit. As we open the case up, you'll see the usual Electronic Arts case for the cartridge. And if I take it out, you'll see that below the cartridge, there's an EA label in the back of the case. So apparently EA was making their own clamshells, which might explain the lack of the hang tab at the top of the case. You can tell the rest of the plastic and construction is not the same as the usual Sega clamshell. And honestly, it feels a bit more flimsy and cheaply made. Also, on the manual side, if you notice, I was just able to take that manual right out. There's no tabs or anything here to hold the manual in place. Just seems weird. They didn't break off or anything. They're just not there. So the manual can just flop around inside the box. As far as the manual goes, this is definitely similar to the later Genesis manuals that ended up completely black and white. Even the cover, and I gotta say, I don't like it. It looks tacky. Even with nothing holding it in place, though, the manual's in decent shape. Other than there's a little bit of bending up here at the top. The actual manual itself isn't very long, as you would expect from a relatively simple game aimed at kids. But it's actually very thorough at explaining the game, and has lots of screenshots and diagrams explaining the game. There's some screenshots there. Let's see. There we go. There's some diagrams there that show the stuff that's actually going on the screen. And there's also the occasional gameplay hint from Grover in here. And I gotta say, some of these are pretty helpful as well. Let's see. Like I say here, hint from Grover. On later days, Bubbles and Little Bird will take you higher and higher. Just an easier way for you to get to the top of some of the later stages. We'll get to that later. Okay, now that you've seen the actual package, let's get to the game itself and see if it's worthy of the Sesame Street name. Sesame Street Counting Cafe puts you in control of the lovable Blue Muppet Grover, as he attempts to work at the Counting Cafe serving his usual demanding customer, fellow Blue Muppet Mr. Johnson. Over the course of 6 days, Grover works long days, serving Mr. Johnson breakfast, brunch, lunch, dinner, and dessert. 6 12-hour days in a row? Apparently Sesame Street has never heard of a union. The days essentially relate to levels, and each meal serves as a stage in that level. The apparently unionless Grover is working for stars instead of money, with Grover attempting to earn 5 stars for each day's performance, and Mr. Johnson gives Grover a star for each meal properly delivered to the table. Any meal delivered improperly will send Grover back to the kitchen to collect the proper amounts of the various foods that Mr. Johnson's craving at that time.
I'm hungry.
So where does the edutainment part of this title come in? Well, Mr. Johnson will ask Grover for 1, 2, or 3 items of food, and then a specific quantity of each of those items. For example, Mr. Johnson might ask Grover for 1 apple, 3 eggs, and 2 hamburgers. Grover, who's carrying a platter, as waiters are wont to do, will stack the various food items on top of one another on the platter. This gives kids playing the game a reason to count the stacks of items, as Grover picks up the foods one at a time. Also, depending on the day and time currently being played, various different other Muppets will show up in the kitchen, and if Grover walks past them, they will either take an item from Grover's platter or put an item onto Grover's platter, throwing off Grover's count of items. This is actually a really nice play mechanic, and it provides a nice way for other Muppets to make cameo appearances in the game, and it makes the player either have to be careful about jumping around the other Muppets that will alter his food tray, or also playing a bit of strategy, i.e. a Muppet that takes one of the food items is between Grover and Mr. Johnson, so perhaps Grover needs to pick up an extra hamburger or pie, so that when Grover walks past that Muppet on the way back, the Muppet will be taking an extra bit of food that Mr. Johnson didn't need. The game really does a good job of making the player count up and down without just throwing out explicit math problems to be solved, and wrecking the entertainment value of the game. And proving the designers tried to think of everything if the players collect too much of a type of food with no way to lose it, or collect the wrong type of food, Cookie Monster's waiting in the storage area at the back of the restaurant, and he'll eat everything you have, allowing you to start completely over and collect the proper amounts from Mr. Johnson. In keeping with the relatively simple mechanics of the game, the controls of the game are relatively simple as well. The game only utilizes one button other than the D-pad, with every button on the controller having the same function of causing Grover to jump up in the air. This despite the fact that Sega sold a Sega Club branded 6-button controller that is apparently slightly smaller than the regular 6-button controller. Hearing that the Sega Club controller is somewhat smaller than the regular one is a bit hard for me to believe considering how small the standard 6-button controller is, but I guess it makes sense considering how small the hands of kindergarten-age kids are. The manual even gives a nice hint to the players that if they're having problems controlling the game, they should put the controller on the ground and play the game as if they're using a joystick, which I thought was a nice touch. Just because the controls in the game are simple, however, it doesn't make them bad. In fact, the game controls very well. Grover is very responsive, moving left, right, and climbing the occasional ladder. And who knew Grover was such a leaper? Well, when he's not in his Super Grover costume anyway. The player will have no problem navigating the various platforms in the game, jumping up to reach various foods, or attempting to chase after a monkey at the end of the day. While the main focus of the game is getting Mr. Johnson's order right via counting items, the platforming aspects make the game fun, and because of the good controls, break up the sum of the repetitiveness of constantly attempting to gather various foods. As stated earlier, the game takes place across 6 days, or levels, and since you're essentially completing the same tasks each day, as you can imagine, the game might get a bit boring. Thankfully, each meal during the 6 days requires different foods to be on the lookout for, and different sets of Muppets will be in the kitchen to potentially interact with or avoid, as the case may be. Also, the foods will appear in wildly different places, and Grover will have to use his big ups sometimes to search the upper levels of the kitchen for items that don't appear when simply moving from left to right. And depending on the day, some foods don't appear at all. Instead, you have to interact with the Muppets that transform one food into another, really making the player think about how they are going to end up with the correct amount of food for Mr. Johnson. However, as I mentioned back in the box description, the back of the box discusses 36 levels. Are there 6 versions of each of the 6 days? Well, that's what I thought originally, but then I realized that 36 levels are the 5 meals each day, plus the final section of each day where you must recover your 5th star from the monkey. So, they weren't lying about the 36 levels of varying difficulty, but it does make the game seem a bit bigger than it is. One good thing I'll say about the level/day structure, though, is that the game does get more difficult as you go. But you don't always have to start at the first day. You can actually choose what day you want to start at. So if a kid is playing that's closer to, say, age 6 than 3, they can choose to go straight to one of the later days if they want, and not waste time on the easier levels. Very cool. From an audio perspective, Counting Cafe is a bit of a marvel, especially for not being a major release. Counting Cafe by far has the most digitized speech of any cartridge-based game I've reviewed so far for Zilog and Moto. It might have the most of any on the console aside from Sega sports titles, with a virtual announcer. Having speech like that is very important for an educational title, especially from a perspective of focusing on the numbers. But beyond that, as anyone who's ever watched The Muppets before can tell you, a large part of Sesame Street is learning through humor, and this game is no different, with Grover being Grover, and the occasional annoyed quip from Mr. Johnson, especially if you're taking your time in collecting his
There
meal.
you go.
As an added bonus, the start button doesn't actually pause the game, it causes Grover to speak while he's not moving around on the screen. The music in the game is pretty good as well. I'm not sure how many background themes there are, but there's certainly enough to keep things interesting, and so that you aren't listening to the same song over and over again.
Now,
The smaller
I'd
children
like
playing the game may not notice a
2
detail like that, but I'm sure their parents will appreciate it.
bananas
On a funny
and
note,
2
pun fully
pies.
intended, the game's intro music sounds strangely like the Leisure Suit Larry theme. Now, I'm pretty sure Al Lowe didn't take time out of his busy schedule to compose music for a Sesame Street game, so I'm just going to chalk that up to an odd coincidence. Graphically, the game isn't that much to speak of, but it's not bad either. Grover's animation when walking and jumping around the screen is relatively smooth, and the frame rate remains a constant 99% of the time. There are lots of bright colors on the screen, which are definitely going to attract a child's attention, and the coloring of the inside of the cafe changes every day.
2 bananas.
There are also large numbers as decorations around the screen,
2 cookies.
and the portrait above Mr. Johnson's table changes to
2
feature a
pies.
picture of a different Muppet
That's
each day.
right. Thank you.
When I started this review of Canning Cafe, I figured it'd be a little bit of a joke, as would all the
There you
Sega Club
go.
/ educational games. But I gotta say, I was really pleasantly surprised by this game.
Hey,
While I would never say this game is for everyone, when you look at it from the aspect of being a 3 to 6 year old, it's far better than it has any right to be. Even I got into it a little bit on the later levels as I was recording game footage, and I might have yelled out, "God damn it, Elmo," a few times. I'm giving Sesame Street Canning Cafe 3 out of 5 stars. And I'm not really sure how they would have made this game any better, and still have it catered to the younger crowd. If you have younger children or grandchildren, and want to give them a taste of the past, you could do far worse than this game.
Well, that was certainly unexpected. I never would have thought that I would have gotten 15, 20 minutes out of a Sesame Street game, but here we are. Tune in next week when we stick with the Genesis again and celebrate the opening of basketball season with a game that goes back to the early days of the system, but is probably not nearly as good as you might think it is. And myself being a Lakers fan, yeah, this one stings a little bit. Remember, whatever you play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.